Security on Happy Hour, where we bring together a group of security professionals and naturally cheery folks to discuss topics in the cybersecurity community, share knowledge, learn, teach, and exchange ideas. Now, before we get started, it's important to point out that the views and opinions expressed on Security on Happy Hour and related websites are those of the hosts, guests, and authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any one company. Now, in this episode, we're going to talk about safe harbor and other legal considerations of a bug bounty and vulnerability disclosure program. Lisa Bradley, Katie Noble, Crob, and I are joined today by Dr. Amit Elazari. Amit is a director of global cybersecurity policy at Intel and a lecturer at UC Berkeley School of Information, Masters in Information and Cybersecurity, as well as a member of the External Advisory Committee for the Center of Long-Term Cybersecurity. She holds a doctoral degree in the law from UC Berkeley and graduated summa cum laude in her three prior degrees. Her work on cybersecurity law, computer crime, privacy, and intellectual property has been presented and published in leading academic journals, top conferences, and featured on leading news sites such as the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. And in 2018, Amit received a UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity grant for her work on private ordering, regulating information security, exploring safe harbors for security researchers. Welcome aboard, Amit. Thanks for joining us. We're really glad to have you here to talk about the legal aspects of bug bounty programs and vulnerability disclosure programs.
Really excited to be here.
To kick us off, I'd like to know, do security researchers have concerns with respect to reporting security vulnerabilities to vendors, whether it's legal or otherwise?
Yeah, that's a great question. No concerns at all, no. So first of all, let me just clarify, while I am trained as a lawyer, I'm not providing legal advice and I'm speaking in personal capacity. So I am a lawyer, but not the audience lawyer. And in fact, these are nuanced issues that are constantly evolving. So I really encourage everyone to seek their own legal advice. But Josh, to a critical question, and really this has been the inspiration of my prior work that I've led when I was UC Berkeley. Absolutely, there is concern. So let's just look at the empirical evidence, for example. We know from research and surveys conducted by NTIA, for example, going far back as 2015, that in the context of vulnerability disclosure program, more than 400 researchers said explicitly that 60% of them, okay, so that's around 2/3, mentioned that threat of potential legal risk is a key consideration, whether to report or not to report a vulnerability in the context of a vulnerability disclosure program. So again, we are differentiating here from bug bounties to vulnerability disclosure program. You want that community to report to you vulnerabilities, right? See something, say something. More than 60% in that sample, already from 2015, mentioned that threat of legal risk is a consideration. We also know from other research conducted by CDT and by academics that this is a key reason whether to participate or not participate in a bug bounty, and that most researchers would work with their organization to disclose something, including in a vulnerability disclosure program, but they choose not to, is because of frustrations around communications. And of course, this consideration, right, or what is the reputation of the company or the organization when it comes to addressing legal concerns is one of the key elements that they're considering. So of course, because of the potential murkiness, right, of anti-hacking legislations across multiple jurisdictions, this concept of the culture of fear of legal risk is very dominant among the community. And this is a key considerations of why, the areas that we should work together to collaborate to facilitate those bridges. And the safe harbor issue we're going to talk about today is one of the bridges, one of the key areas in which the community, the industry, including policymakers, came together to try to drive more certainty and build those bridges, specifically when it comes to language and bug bounties and vulnerability disclosure programs.
Do you think, I'm sorry, I have so many questions. Do you think that researchers pay attention to past lawsuits that there might have been, or do they look for certain language on a policy page to feel comfortable, or do they wait for, when they actually say, hey, I found an issue, what are your rules about it? Like, how do they go about it? And I'm just trying to think as an industry person, like, what can I do to make sure that researchers are feeling welcome to come to me?
So I think this landscape really developed. If we really look at the safe harbor language, for example, we started the place around 2017, 2016, where that language was not as prominent. And if you just look at the number of programs that adopted that language today, we are talking about serious multipliers. So today, we have default safe harbor language that got promoted by both the bug bounty platforms, but also by initiatives like the DOJ Code and Vulnerability Disclosure recommendations and considerations that they have published in 2017, and things like the CISA and we talk a little bit more about these issues. But today, with Disclose.io, with a lot of the community coming together and driving focus around this, we are seeing a lot more language adopted by bug bounties, by vulnerability disclosure programs around this issue. And this is becoming a best practice, right? Also through the lens of the community. So I think today researchers are more aware and are more looking for this language, in the actual vulnerability disclosure program or the bug bounty. That being said, they're not just looking at the language. Of course, the reputation of the organization is a critical piece of it. There have been some researchers that had some experiences with some companies in the past. And of course, the community is looking around these issues. This is something that is not universal. We have researchers with less experience, with more experience. It's, of course, depending on the fact on whether you are participating in a bug bounty, right, where you're actually incentivized, and the terms of conditions might be different, whether it's a private bug bounty, right, versus a vulnerability disclosure program, where in a vulnerability disclosure program, really, there are no incentives that are monetary incentives. You're really asking the researchers to actively participate and report issues, and that's where that legal incentives is even more critical. From the empirical research that we have seen, we know it's a key consideration for the community. We don't know to what extent, because we don't have big samples enough of research, this is actually a decision driving a decision factor in terms of, consider, if you compare it, for example, to incentives, if you compare it to other issues. I think we're still working on collecting that survey information, but the more we will have more academic research and, empirical research in that respect, we will know to actually, say whether the safe harbor is an empirical driver. But from anecdotal evidence, especially, from the experiences that I hear from researchers and from companies and from organizations, especially in the context of vulnerability disclosure program, we know that the safe harbor matters. We know that communications matters. We know that this kind of incentives are really critical to the community.
Yeah. I didn't know that there was like an actual name around it. I mean, I knew that, we wanted to make sure researchers were coming to us and not feeling like we were going to threaten them, but I didn't realize they put a, like in a safe harbor, like I didn't know they named it officially. Like, I'm like the only one who didn't know that. Maybe. Yeah.
I think there is a lot of nuance here. So I think the safe harbor is a term that has been getting a lot of attention. I think, especially if I look at my prior work, what I've tried to drive with legal bug bounty, and today Disclose.io, which is a really important initiative that is led by Casey and many others. They use the terminology of safe harbor to basically describe a scenario when you have language in the contract or in the terms of conditions of the bug bounty or the vulnerability disclosure program that try to address some of the uncertainties around anti-hacking laws. So specifically, they would potentially grant authorization under the relevant anti-hacking laws, or say, the organization is committing to not pursue legal action if you follow the terms and conditions of the policy. And the safe harbor term, which is a term, by the way, that is used in many other contexts, right, in the policy regime. So just for example, the DMCA safe harbor is a commonly used term in the context, in a very different context, which is copyright law, right? That term was borrowed from that landscape, but what's important to recognize that, you know, when it comes to that legal landscape, you know, no language, you know, is complete certainty. There is always a lot of details. You know, what are the actually terms and conditions? What is the actually nuance in terms of the jurisdiction, the legislation? But what we did with the safe harbor and with the attempt to standardize a set of contractual language is try to drive a best practice within the industry, not to replicate or replace the legal advice, but rather, you know, create a terminology, a common terminology, very similar to Creative Commons, if you're familiar with that, or open source licenses, right? From the software context, so we can all talk about the same kind of, you know, terminology, with the understanding that the security research ecosystem, right? It's a very large ecosystem. And sometimes we are not talking about, you know, sophisticated players. There are many jurisdictions involved, so we need to drive a common terminology, right, to establish that best practice. So when we talk about the safe harbor and this idea of, you know, here is some more certainty around the potential legal implications around anti-hacking laws, here is some language around authorization, here is commitments from the organization in the bug bounty contract language or in the vulnerability disclosure. It's not to suggest that this is, you know, an all-encompassing solutions, but this is elevating some of the uncertainty, and this is advancing our understanding of the best practices by providing standardized language that organizations can take to their lawyers, take to their organizations, and see what's the best fit for their purposes.
I want to go back to something you said about at the very beginning about the researchers' concern for reporting security vulnerabilities because of the potential legal risk associated with that. Is there a counter to that where they might have a legal liability because they know of vulnerability and they haven't reported it? I mean, are they concerned about that as well? Are you hearing that from them? Or are they more concerned about the alternative?
I think that's a landscape that I have not followed as closely in my prior research. It's also very nuanced, you know, as the landscape of incident reporting requirements is evolving, right, in multiple jurisdictions. There is a lot of you know, research and leadership in that domain. There is research that is focusing on the element of freedom of expression, right, and First Amendment considerations. So when I originally started with this research, you know, my main focus was I looked at the landscape. Probably one of the first legal papers out there ever on bug bounty contracts. And what I've seen is that we had very different languages. So the bug bounty did not have one set of common terms. The vulnerability disclosure program landscape did not have one set of common terms. There were a lot of parallel efforts to drive that, drive frameworks and best practices, including by NTIA, including by many others, but we haven't seen one language. We had very different terminologies, and this particular issue around addressing in the language specific issues around anti-hacking laws, having that quote unquote safe harbor or partial safe harbor language, that was not something that was in there. So my focus was really about the considerations of the community on the anti-hacking legislation side, and less about, you know, failure to report, failure to disclose, but rather what happens if I disclose it in terms of the protections that I could have under potential anti-hacking laws.
Gotcha. That helps.
What type of complications does international jurisdiction play into this? Like the nationality of the researcher versus the nationality of the organization they're reported to. Does that help or hurt the process?
Yeah, I think, again, it's a very complicated landscape because anti-hacking laws are not universal. But let's, you know, very generally speaking, let's talk about the key term that, you know, I often refer to, especially in my prior work, which is this concept of authorization. In most anti-hacking legislation, that's of course true for the CFAA in the United States and the state legislation in the United States, but also in Europe, in other jurisdictions, The main question is whether the security research was authorized, was there consent? Now, if you think about the landscape of pen testing contracts, right? We have players from all over the world collaborating under contractual regime, obtaining consent to test the system. That's a very common, regime we use to allow, security vendors to conduct pen testing. The challenge with bug bounty programs, and I'm distinguishing between them and vulnerability disclosure programs, is that these are crowdsourced contracts being used, right, for multiple researchers with one set of language. So how do you create consent and authorization or make commitments or make or clarify the expectations in terms of how would the parties would engage around this issue of authorization and pursuing legal actions? That's kind of the main anti-hacking, I would say, implication. But in addition to that, there are many other legal considerations that may, potentially come to play coming from the IP, intellectual property. So often you would see, for example, a license to actually use the report, copyright license in bug bounty contracts. We've also seen in bug bounty contracts, especially if you look at my prior work, some language around other legal issues that are coming from, trade or other, potential considerations. So the jurisdiction of the particular reporter absolutely can, can be relevant. But most anti-hacking laws, and I'm really generalizing here, and people should seek their own advice and look in more details when it comes to a particular piece of legislation. For example, CFAA, most anti-hacking laws would actually have extraterritorial jurisdiction. So they're not just focusing on whether, the hacking is conducted by a researcher potentially by a researcher in one jurisdiction, but rather extraterritorial implication, with the goal, of course, to protect the computer or to protect the relevant player in the jurisdiction. And that's why, again, these issues are, as the internet in general, are global, and that's where those kind of considerations come into play.
Have you seen governments and kind of industry bodies stepping up to try to help remove some of the complexity or to try to assist in facilitating this research at all?
Absolutely. So I think one of the most interesting developments in this landscape is not just how corporations, industry, researchers, even the bug bounty platforms themselves are stepping up to create best practices and common language that could be leveraged, like, for example, the Disclose IO effort. And we have seen a lot more adoption, right, of safe harbor language, and researchers acknowledging this adoption, saying explicitly, we will participate in programs because you're facilitating this adoption. Not only that, we have also seen policymakers really recognizing the importance of working with the community, especially in the context of vulnerability disclosure program. Now, with more and more policymakers' attention to the importance, right, of working with the community and having those vulnerability disclosure programs in place, including for federal agencies, there is also recognition of the importance of the safe harbor. So just to give one example, and there are many, as part of the discussion in the United States, right, on facilitating vulnerability disclosure programs for federal agencies, we have seen the issuance by CISA of BOD 20001, which Katie and many others are very familiar with. And the safe harbor is actually listed as a key consideration in BOD 20001 as something that federal agencies should consider as they're going about creating vulnerability disclosure program. What exactly is the language they want to incorporate? Similarly, the DoD have been one of the leaders in incorporating that kind of language in the vulnerability disclosure program even before CISA BOD 01. And the DOJ really advanced our conversation by releasing their framework for legal considerations of around vulnerability disclosure programs in 2017. And of course, this is not just limited to the United States, also in Europe, in other jurisdictions, we have seen more and more focus on addressing the legal implications together with the conversation around facilitating more vulnerability disclosure program, including for governmental assets.
Yeah. Oh, the CISA BOD. Oh, that fun story about the CISA BOD. So I was one of the primary authors on the CISA BOD, and it started because I was really, really tired of getting text messages at like 3 a.m. from this guy who was at DDS, which is the Defense Digital Services at the Pentagon, saying, hey, can you talk to Congressman so-and-so about bug bounties and vulnerability disclosure programs and how that relates to the federal executive agencies? And I got so tired of hearing those requests. So I was like, I'm tired of talking to Congress about this. I'm going to do something. And so we went into work and talked to our legislative affairs people, and we're like, can we do something about this? And they're like, yeah, you can do something. And so we did. We wrote the bod. Yay! And that was delightful. And so there's my fun story on that. But I have a question.
Is that somebody we know, perhaps? Maybe?
Yes, it is. It is someone we know. It's Roro. It was my text messages at like, and he's like, can you talk to Senator Harris's office? And I'm like, no, yes, I can. I'd be happy to talk to Senator Harris's office. That'd be fine. But I was like, we keep having the same questions come up over and over again. So there was clearly interest, and there was clearly we hadn't yet been legislated, but we had seen all these legislations pop up. And so we're like, well, we better legislate or be legislated. So we're like, well, what if we write a binding operational directive that covers all the federal executive agencies, which is what our domain was at CISA, and say, like, let's just make sure that we're taking care of managing our own space so that others can not have to think about that. So that was the thought behind the bod. But I have another question, Amit. So when we talk about like safe harbor practices, I think we often maybe think about the researcher, but who does safe harbor really protect? Does it protect the company? Does it protect the researcher? Does it protect the citizen, the client, the end user? Like, who does safe harbor protect?
I think, the main goal of the original language is really about the researcher, right? Because if you look at and again, I use the term protection with context, right? You always need to look at the policy and the language with the context of the jurisdiction, with the context of the other laws that could apply. But the goal was really to create a set of terminology that can be leveraged, subject to the organization needs and their own legal advice, that provides the relevant authorization under the relevant anti-hacking laws in the jurisdiction to test the systems if the researcher is following the terms of the policy, right, the terms and condition. So one set of the safe harbor is that explicit authorization under the anti-hacking laws. That's consent, right, to test the system, not implicit, but explicit in the contract language, again, subject to the scope of the actual policy. The other piece of safe harbor, which is often termed, again, academically, partial safe harbor, is that commitment not to pursue legal action. So setting the expectations, if you're going to report and you will follow the policy, we will not pursue legal action. We will not recommend you to law enforcement. There is another piece, which is how you're going to operate when it comes to third-party systems. Part of it is clarifying that you cannot grant authorization in the name of third parties. That key consideration is actually outlined in the recommendation by the DOJ from 2017. And part of it is setting the expectation that if a third party would approach you, how are you going to handle that? For example, are you going to obtain the consent of the researchers before giving their name, giving the report to a third party? So most of that kind of original terminology was about elevating some of the uncertainty with the researcher's own risk under the relevant anti-hacking law. But I think what we recognize, specifically with the best practices around the language, is that with the nuance in this landscape, with how this landscape evolves, terms and conditions of bug bounties are important, right? And it's an important piece of the organization, basically approach towards the bug bounties. So setting up those expectations, driving clarity, right? That is something that is actually very helpful to organizations as they work with the community. We also know that it actually matters how clear is the terminology, right? How basically you're communicating. And the more you see clear communications, we actually know from empirical research that researchers value that, So they look at the brief, they look at the scope, they look at the terms and conditions, they look for clarity. And the more clear you're setting the expectations, you should assume to have, at least in bug bounties, more active participation from the community when you're competing for the eyeballs, right, with the rest of the bug bounty industry. So I think, again, the safe harbor is focused on the researcher, but the entire ecosystem values from driving that clarity. And of course, the entire ecosystem values from advancing the interests of the researcher.
Right. So when we talk about that, you talked about the clearness, right? So I'm your friendly vendor in a company, and I'm, hey, friendly. Yes, I am. When you say how do I go about integrating this in or being clear? Do I take language that already exists, or do I work with my lawyers to do it? But because you say clear, and I love my lawyers, but sometimes lawyer and legal language isn't so clear. So how do you accomplish both here?
I don't know. I get to work with the best lawyers.
Yes, you do.
I've seen multiple approaches to this. So first of all, we have best practices and standards out there. We have language like Disclose.io and other language. There is actual language in BOD 2001. There is language in the 2017 DOJ framework. And organizations should take a look at that, but then really dig in and find the right solution that comports with their needs, right? Not every program is the same. Those things matter. What's your scope, for example? That's one of the key questions. Is it a private bug bounty? Is it a public bug bounty? All of these considerations come into play as you're considering the language. So you can start at looking at the environment, then seek your own legal advice, talk with your lawyers. But when it comes to actually driving clarity, one of the most interesting things that I've seen is workshop the language internally. Work with your peers, work with researchers, test the language out. Is that clear? Can you understand what I'm saying here? And I've seen a lot of focus, right, on simplifying the language as much as possible through collaboration with the community. So getting, similar to the view that you would get often from consumers or from users or from peers, you can, take that language with your internal stakeholders, workshop it out and see if it's clear to your own security researchers, for example, and learn from that with respect to what can be leveraged with the external security ecosystem.
That's an interesting point, right? So leverage, if you have security researchers, a team, if you're a big enough company that you have those kind of people on staff, leverage their experience and knowledge of the industry as a litmus test for what you're going to put in writing, right?
Well, or even just take, maybe someone on your team that's not into crazy security stuff and have them read it and see if it makes sense, right? It sounds like just as simple as that. Like, make sure that somebody off the street would understand what you were trying to say.
I like to run everything by the marketing group. I find if I run everything by the marketing and PR folks, they're like the most they're the most with it when it comes to the user's gonna understand this one, or that is real complicated.
Yeah.
They help me out the most. I love their mindset for things like that.
I'll give you that for PR. I'll debate you about marketing.
I don't know. I think our marketing folks are great. I like to ask them questions about how do they interact with customers and what are some of the questions that they get from customers, because I find it's very insightful, but they're the ones hand in hand. They're the ones talking directly to the people that, are our immediate stakeholder. So it's a very helpful point of view to me, but I don't know. Okay. So I guess one of I just wonder, there's so many different laws going on. There's so many different little, each country's got different things. Regions have different things, different places. I heard in Germany, there's a requirement that everyone, if you find a vulnerability, you have to report it. You're required to, or maybe that's Netherlands. I can't remember. But then I have to wonder, how does the CFAA and the DMCA and how do these anti-hacking laws, how do they play into the safe harbor landscape?
Yeah, so we touched a little bit on it, but let's let's make it more explicit, right? So the CFAA key, I would say, provision around that is often discussed and debated in the context of authorization, 1038.2, right, talks about the concept of exceeding authorization or accessing a computer and obtaining information without authorization, right? And there is a lot of discussions, including a Supreme Court, case that is evolving and a former circuit split on what are the boundaries of the authorization. Are there technical boundaries, are there contractual boundaries, and the like? And actually, in this domain, again, there is a lot of academic and other general research out there that I recommend, and for our viewers to take a look, because we're not going to drill down on this right now. But for example, I think Harley from Rapid7 recently did a talk on an event just end of March, and you can find all of that on YouTube. And Leonard Bailey from the Department of Justice have done many talks, including in Black Hat and DEF CON and other venues, when he walked through the landscape. So people can find that information out there, and it's very illuminating. But let's go back to the basic. This concept of authorization is a key element of both, the CFAA provisions in terms of the anti-hacking federal legislation, but also in the context of the DMCA, whether you circumvent the protection measures on code as potentially copyright protected material without the authorization of the copyright owner. So in both these key main federal anti-hacking legislation in the United States, we have that concept of authorization as a key consideration on the boundaries of security research, potentially. And if authorization is the key concept, right, how can we potentially grant authorization? That's where the contractual language, right, fits in. So the relationship of the contract towards the anti-hacking law is that the contract serves as a vehicle to explicitly provide authorization to test the systems. So hopefully that's clear, and that kind of connects the dots between, the type of language you usually would find in either an explicit safe harbor or partial safe harbor versus the anti-hacking law focus on the concept of authorization.
I think this is really, really important, right? Because we have, the work in the bug bounty programs are so dependent on relationships and trust, and being able to take information from people that are outside of your organization and take some action on it, and having a relationship that ensures, both parties are working in the best interest of, say, an end user or the customer. This sounds like, when you boil it down to the authorization, that helps to establish at least an olive branch of trust from the vendor to the researcher to say, I authorize you to go do this work. I trust that you're going to do it with the best of intentions and in following the program. I think there's always risks of that being abused, and we've seen that happen in the industry before, where even though we extend the olive branch, sometimes there are, I think, emotions tend to get involved, and that creates some of the tension that we might see in the system. But ultimately, as a vendor, we have to try to operate from the best of intentions, assuming the best of intentions, right? So, yeah. Well, this is a really powerful topic, and I think it's really relevant to everything that we do in vulnerability handling and disclosure in the bug bounty program. And Amit, I am really grateful that you took the time to spend with us and explain all this, because this is probably a subject a lot of people who are starting a bug bounty program don't really think about. They don't realize how important it is to at least become familiar with some of these terms and the nuances of the legal system, and how that can really help you build a foundation for your relationships with security researchers. So thank you for taking the time to join us and explain all of this to our audience and to us. So with that, I will invite everybody to come and listen to our next episode, which will come shortly after this one. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye.